Let's get some U.S. reaction now and speak to SABC News correspondent Nick Harper, who is live for us in Washington, D.C. Nick, a very good afternoon to you. So, Russian President Putin basically saying that the U.S. strikes on Iran are pushing the world to dangerous line. This also as there are now heightened fears to see just how Iran will retaliate following the United States strike on Iran's 3 nuclear sites. And of course, that strong indication that Iran could possibly close the Strait of Hormuz. Just give us reaction then on the ground from the U.S.
Yeah, very interesting that we've seen that international condemnation against the United States. The Russian president making those comments very much in line with what we saw unfold at the UN Security Council on Sunday afternoon. Iran and China and Russia all coming out very strongly against the United States. Here in the US, of course, it's a very different reaction. The White House has been doubling down on that action, saying that it was right to take that decision and it was needed for keeping the world much, much safer. But in terms of retaliation, there is still that fear that we could see Iran retaliate. Of course, the US has warned it very strongly not to do so and instead to seek peace. But there are about 40,000 US personnel scattered throughout the region at a variety of military bases there, all of them now on high alert, very much in a defensive posture. The US has pre-positioned a number of aircraft carriers in the region. It is sending more fighter jets to the region as well, all of them preparing for that possibility of retaliation. If Iran strikes, then the US says that it is ready to strike back.
And also, I mean, there's a lot of people awaiting an official response here from the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. You know, Tehran denounced the U.S. and Israel at that emergency UN Security Council meeting and also voiced its skepticism just about the potential for diplomacy. When we talk diplomacy, I mean, what are the possibilities now of de-escalation at this point with U.S. involvement, do you think?
Well, it seems very difficult to think that negotiations will be able to take place. But of course, that is the US position. It is hoping that having weakened Iran by taking out 3 of its nuclear facilities, it now will be able to push Iran to the negotiating table to do some sort of deal, not just on the ceasefire between Iran and Israel, but potentially doing a deal that looks much further into the future, that gets Iran to drop its nuclear ambitions and does a deal with the United States that means it will not continue to enrich uranium, in which it says that it will not seek to possess a nuclear weapon. But all of that seems very difficult. As you say, the Iranians are basically signaling that they are not in the mood to negotiate after those US strikes over the weekend. And then added to that, comments coming out of the White House in the last 12 hours or so from the US president suggesting that he would like to see regime change in Iran. Now, that has not been the messaging from his other top officials. The Vice President, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, all of them have not been suggesting they want to change the regime. They've been saying that the airstrikes over the weekend were limited in scope, and essentially that is the end of the US involvement in Iran. But Donald Trump's message on social media over the weekend said, if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't there be a regime change? We've seen the White House press secretary clarify those comments in the last few hours, saying that Donald Trump was just raising a question, something that Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary, said many people around the world were considering. And she suggested it was now up to the Iranian people to, in her words, rise up against the regime to try and force some sort of change. Obviously, Iran is in a much weaker position now than it has been in recent months. Not just the airstrikes at the weekend targeting those nuclear facilities, but we've also seen its proxies in the region weakened. Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, in a much weaker position now. The US is hoping, therefore, Iran will make a deal. But it does seem hard at this stage to think that they will want to do so off the back of a weekend of airstrikes.
Absolutely. It most certainly will look that way. I want to just touch on how ordinary US citizens are viewing this, Nick. I mean, Trump over the years, as we know, has always criticized U.S. involvement in overseas wars and conflicts, including, of course, Iraq. What are ordinary Americans who had no interest in the U.S. involvement in this war saying?
Well, that's right. I mean, Donald Trump, coming into his second term in the White House, was very much trying to paint himself as the president of peace, someone who would not get the US involved again in those so-called forever wars. Considering the US has now managed to pull out of Iraq, Afghanistan as well, the US president was saying that he would not want to return to the Middle East. So the fear is, with this military action over the weekend, that this could be dragging the US back into a region that it's worked very hard to extricate itself from. In terms of the public reaction, it is mixed. There are certainly people who are praising the president, saying that it was right for him to, after many years of the US administration's not doing so, to take on the Iranian regime and to carry out airstrikes targeting nuclear facilities. But we've also seen plenty of protests spring up over the course of the weekend, including protesters here in Washington, D.C., who were telling Donald Trump, just outside of his house, that he was, in their words, a war criminal, saying that he had violated the UN Charter, international law, even the US Constitution, because he had carried out these airstrikes unilaterally as opposed to seeking approval from Congress. Certainly a mixed opinion. Those protests haven't reached fever pitch yet, but there is the possibility, especially if the US continues with more airstrikes in the future against Iran, those protests, that anti-Donald Trump sentiment could grow as a result of what we've seen in the Middle East over the last few days.
Nick, thank you so much for that update. Correspondent for the SABC, Nick Harper, live for us from Washington, D.C.